So the first thing I want to dive into is really what makes Scott Pilgrim vs. the World so wonderful. There are quite a few different items to go through in this list, including the wardrobe of the cast, the awesome stylistic humor, the soundtrack, the character growth, the imaginativeness, and the creativeness that director Edgar Wright employs. There's so much beauty in this film to be had. And starting with the humor of this movie, I think that this movie is absolutely one-liners galore. There are so many quotable moments in the film between just about every single character. In fact, I've got a whole segment dedicated to the best one-liners in the entire movie. Another thing that makes this movie so funny is the fact that all the characters are kind of slightly mean and douchey to each other. For example, you've got Stacy Pilgrim, Scott's sister. She's really mean to him. You've got Wallace, his roommate, who's kind of a douche to him. You've got Julie Powers, who is crushed by Aubrey Plaza in one of her debuts, also being a dick to Scott. All of it is just really, really funny. And even a lot of the small details and set pieces all come together in order to make for a really funny experience. One of them that comes to mind is the scene where Scott is facing off against Roxy for the first time in the alley, and he basically tells her to go away. He immediately runs to a payphone to call his sister Stacy while she's working at the coffee shop, and he asks her, "Hey, I'm having a meltdown right now. Are you working?" And then she goes, "I'm literally about to leave." And he goes, "Cool, I'm coming in." And the camera kind of pans out just a little bit, and we can see that Scott is just calling right outside of the coffee shop. Like literally, if he turned around, he could see for himself that Stacy was in fact working. I thought that was a really funny, punchy detail that it's so in line with Edgar Wright's humor, and I just absolutely loved it. And additionally, when they are going through Lucas Lee's commercials, and Lucas Lee's performance is absolutely crushed by Chris Evans. I thought he was electric in this film. They're filming a preview of a movie of his, and one of the lines he says in the film is along the lines of, "Listen here, bucko, the next two clicks you're going to hear are first me hanging up the phone, and the second one is pulling the trigger." And Van from the Big Picture podcast pointed this out, and this didn't even occur to me till he said this. And when you shoot a gun and you hear a clicking sound, it means the gun is empty. So he'd effectively be shooting an empty gun at whoever he's threatening. So I thought that was really funny too. And to top it all off, in the very first fight scene that Scott has against Ramon's first evil ex-boyfriend, which is Matthew Patel, in the middle of the fight, Wallace just kind of breaks out there and he says, "Hey, what's up with that guy's outfit?" And then another guy just chimes in. He's like, yeah, is he a pirate? And then they all just kind of attack this dude's outfit out of thin air in the middle while they're fighting. It's just so on the nose of this movie. And it's moments like that that really combine to make the humor and tone of this film special. It's so subtle, it's really effective, and it's not too much in your face or over the top. And there's just so many moments like that to absolutely love and chew off of. And now kind of transcending into the imaginativity and the creativity of the film, one thing that I really appreciate is the on-screen text edits that you see a lot of times. The example that comes to mind is at the very beginning, and also kind of in that first scene at the Rocket Amphitheater, where Scott is kind of just staring off into space. He's looking at Ramona and Knives, who are sitting next to each other, and Steven is freaking out and he's kind of yelling, but you can't really hear him. So there's on-screen text that says, "Oh my God, Scott, would you look at me? You're freaking me out." I think edits like that, and also those from The Voice at the very beginning, talking about the story of Toronto, Canada, how Scott is in there and he's dating a high schooler. I think those on-screen edits were way ahead of their time, and they are really subtle and effective in a world now, like with TikTok, with Instagram Reels, where having subtitles on just about everything is super common. I think that this was a stylistic choice that, one, really worked well in the movie, and two, totally fits in with the times as of 2022. I doubt that that's what Edgar Wright had intended in doing so, to fit in with the times today, but even so, I gotta give the man a lot of props for being 12 years ahead of the game, because that's just impressive. And it's something that you never really saw done in movies and continue not to see in movies, so it's very unique and adds that bit of flavor to the film. And I also really enjoyed the tying in of different video game animations with Scott's different milestones throughout the movie. Like, for example, every time that you saw him defeat an evil X, his score and the amount of points he would get would actually go up by 1,000. Like with Matthew Patel, he got 1,000. With Lucas Lee, it was 2,000. And then when you get all the way up to the Katayanagi twins, it was 5 and 6,000. And then finally with Gideon, it got up to 7,000 points. And then you even see him get up a life against the Kadianagi twins, which all of that together, it just, again, it's that unique imaginative style of the movie that you really haven't seen all that much. I mean, the most recent version of that I can think of that touches Scott Pilgrim is Free Guy with Ryan Reynolds, which is another great movie if you're looking for something else to add into the mix. And additionally, the transitions that this movie had were absolutely superb because one, they were not only comical, but two, they actually showed Scott's state of mind and how he's progressing as a character. For example, when Scott is with Knives at the library and he sees Ramona in person for the very first time, they're sitting there in the library and then all of a sudden it immediately cuts to him and the rest of his bandmates at practice, and then he's like, whoa, what's happening? And then he says, and then Steven Still says, you only played one note the entire song. Before you know it, you're cutting again to hours later when they're going to a party. It shows a few things about Scott, and for one, it shows how enamored he was with Ramona because everything else just kind of blackens out to the rest of the world. That's all he can think about is Ramona. And just those three transitions, he completely forgets that Knives is even there. He's with her at the library. He forgets all about her presence, that even though she's standing right next to him, she's sitting on the couch at band practice. He doesn't even realize that she's there. And it also shows that he doesn't really care much about his involvement with the band, which to me is so sensical within the context of the movie that Neil ends up being the main bass guitarist for Sex Bomb, because it's clearly evident through some of these transitions and other moments throughout the movie that Scott really just doesn't care about the band that much at all. So it's appropriate that Neil takes over in his place, which to me wrapped up the ending of the film actually pretty nicely. And now I want to touch upon one of the biggest gems of the film by far, which is the soundtrack. What's beautiful about the soundtrack, it probably consists of a lot of acts that you've never even heard of. And the musical style actually within Scott Pilgrim vs. the World is really unique because it's not really done by one single composer. What Edgar Wright and Michael Bacall did was essentially reach out to all these different musical acts to go ahead and write songs specifically for the movie that then they could portray and play in their own venues, thus making it all sound like very authentic music rather than just music made for a movie. And for me, it opened my eyes to this whole new world of artists that I had never heard of, like Metric, Frank Black, Beck, who's a Canadian artist, and who also played the music behind Sex Bomb. And what's even crazier about Beck is the fact that him and a friend of his made the entire sound and soundtrack of Sex Bomb and all their music in his garage in like a day. It was just him and one other guy, and they just totally fleshed it out with lyrics and everything. And I want to touch on the wardrobe for a second because it's a really subtle piece of the movie that I think adds a lot to it, and that's within actually Scott's different shirts that he has. If you'll notice throughout the film, he pretty much wears the same style of shirt. It's a t-shirt with very few words on it. He might have Zero, he might have Plumtree, which, hey, fun fact, Plumtree is actually one of the artists of one of the songs on the soundtrack, which is ironically called Scott Pilgrim. They're a Canadian-based band. But I just love how the shirts kind of subtly convey where Scott is at different points in the movie. In fact, Edgar Wright points out that in his fight with Todd, that Scott has a shirt that says 0 on it, and it shows that he's just kind of not quite all the way there. He's got 0 lives, which totally adds up because he doesn't get that additional life until after the Kadianagi twins fight. It's just a small detail I really enjoyed about the film. It doesn't make or break it, but it's one of those subtle things that you can really appreciate. And I also really love the idea of the fact that they change up the look of Knives and Ramona actually pretty often throughout the movie. I'm not sure why they did it, but I thought it really worked. I don't know if it was the showcase that they're impulsive. I don't know if it was the showcase their angst, their upsetness or whatever, but to me, just really, really worked. And additionally, although I will admit that it is a little bit flawed, I actually really enjoyed the character growth of Scott by the time that the movie does end, mainly for the idea of second chances. I think people are very deserving of second chances, and although Scott doesn't get everything right the first time around, he does end up learning his lessons and growing as a human being and being a better person for it by the time the movie ends, because leading up to the very end, Scott's not really a great human. Like, he's really careless, he's really reckless, he doesn't really care who he hurts. He hurts a lot of people, he's hurt a lot of people in his past, and I think this film is really that journey of him finally learning to really grow up a little bit and to understand what it fully means to be a great partner, which is a great lesson for really anybody to take.